everybody. Thanks for being here. For those watching out there, my name is Barry Threw. I'm the Executive Director of the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. We're a San Francisco-based 21st century countercultural institution focused on cultivating communities of practice that are focused on creative action for social transformation, applying interdisciplinary practice through arts, science, technology, and the humanities towards some of the most complex challenges we're facing today. And we're delighted to be hosting this panel on arts funding ecosystems, particularly comparing things between the US and EU and funding support of the arts here in the Bay Area in particular. Thank you to the EUNIC global partners for supporting this exposure art tech policy days here to showcase some of the exciting work that a variety of independent organizations are doing here in the Bay Area. And just briefly introduce our panelists who we're delighted to have join us here today. We have Gitte Zschoch. She is the director of EUNIC, EU National Institutes for Culture. We have Camille Baker from the UK, who's the representative from the S+T+ARTS program and is at the University of Creative Arts in London. And we have Tina Vaz, who's the head of the Artist in Residence program and the Analog Research Lab at Facebook, and Gian Pablo Villamil, who's the development director for NTT Disruption. And moderating our panel today, delighted to have Maria Jenson, who's the creative and executive director of the SOMArts Cultural Center right here in San Francisco.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. And it's great to see everyone in this virtual reality. Just want to let you know I'm here in the Bay Area and I'm able to breathe still. You probably have heard that we are experiencing nothing short of an apocalypse. And I hope wherever my colleagues are this morning that you are doing well too. And I just want to say that this is a conversation. I have a few questions to ask each one of you, but I think for people watching panels that they don't want to get stuck just seeing a moderator talking. So feel free to just jump in and just make this feel as live as it is in this particular moment. So first of all, I do like the idea that this is kind of named US versus EU. It sounds like a soccer match, like we should really just get in there, and, so let's just start things off. Gitte, what is your funding strategy for how to support culture, and how is that important to your organization, and why are you doing this?
Well, so maybe just to take a few steps back. So our network is the network of organizations of the EU member states that deal with cultural relations. So each of the EU member states has one particular organization, be it an association that is more privately organized, be it an actual ministry. And so we as a network here, we're registered in Belgium as an association, nonprofit association. And we're funded by our members' contributions. So I guess we're sort of a hybrid ourselves, but I think we're closer to public funding, as a system, because all of our members usually receive public funding. And so our mission is to build trust and understanding between the peoples of Europe and the wider world. And we do that through culture, and our understanding of culture is pretty wide. So it's not just the arts, but it's also education, it's cultural heritage, it's culture and development. And sort of our role is threefold maybe. It's to bring our members, all of these different national bodies together to collaborate in European spirit. We're also working with the EU on cultural relations and making that an important aspect of foreign policy. And then we also sort of support all these different branches that our members have, and where they join up, sort of where there's more than 3 in one place, then that's sort of formalized as a unique so-called cluster. And there, we here in Brussels, we also support activities that are going on, such as yours, actually the grid, but through our internal funding instrument, like a grant scheme that we have, where we ask our members to pledge in, and then we sort of redistribute that. And the idea is to sort of create partnerships with artistic organizations, throughout the world with our members. Maybe that as a start.
That's one amazing start. Does anyone have any questions for Gitte about the work that she's doing and how she's approaching this from our panelists? Okay, so I'm going to kind of mix things up a little bit in terms of, I'm not going to ask everyone the same exact question. I'm just going to kind of switch it up so that we're kind of covering all bases in terms of this overall very broad topic. But I will say I'm super impressed with the way that you're approaching things around public funding, and also the whole idea of building trust and understanding on this global platform is like essential in this particular moment. So Camille, maybe you want to also, take us a step back a little bit and talk about, a little bit more about who you are and the work that you do. But my question is, where you are, how has COVID affected, your strategies for the near or long term in terms of, how you're approaching this?
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with my background. I'm actually from Canada, but I've been in the UK for nearly 14 years, and I got involved in something that we're internally calling pre-starts, or that's good enough. And it was an initiative to find out, the European Commission just asked a number of people. I got pulled in through my university, and it was tell us or help us figure out how artists can stimulate innovation and how they can work with technologists. So that was in 2012. And I've sort of been involved in one sense or another since. I've changed universities. I'm at the University for the Creative Arts now. It's actually not in London. Sorry to correct you. But it's actually serving the southern areas of the UK, in Surrey and in Kent. And my role has been more of being involved in projects. And so these projects are, a call goes out by the commission to do something. And it was really a unique branch of the European Commission, DigiConnect, that started to see the role that artists could play in stimulating innovation. And so to cover your question, in the short term, the current project I'm in, STARTS Ecosystem, is really about bringing, so since 2012, a number of, we could call STARTS umbrella projects have hatched in different forms, and some are about acknowledging the projects that are already out there in the world that are espousing this amazing intersection between art and science, art and technology, and creating something innovative. Not always an artwork, could be a design or innovation or idea. And but there's been multiple different kinds of instantiations, and so we'll get back to that maybe later. But in terms of the COVID situation, we were just starting to grow and push beyond our own STARTS initiative, our own STARTS projects, and trying to reach out the larger European community of artists. And it's strange to say that COVID has been a good thing, but for us, it was a brilliant thing because it enabled us to ask our community, what are you doing? How are you feeling? What can we do to help you? So that'll be my sort of answer, really, is that we kicked off a number of online meetups where we not only asked those questions, but we did webinars. We connected with Leonardo, also in the US, and started doing joint sessions. So we did a lot of things in COVID, and it really helped build our community and grow our community. But we've also seen ourselves as service providers to that community. How can we support whatever it is that they're doing? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that. I think it's interesting that you mentioned COVID as a good thing, and I find myself, trying to not explain, but I've also been talking about that with my team as well. So it'd be interesting for us to kind of loop back around. I'd love to hear how other people might be thinking of like COVID as, I mean, I know it's an ironic thing to say it's a good thing. We're not saying that COVID itself is a good thing, but I think that in a moment of chaos, what comes out of that, because that is kind of like the birth of all creativity and innovation. I think a lot of times, we always want to put things on a spin. We want to turn a prism, and this situation has forced that in a way that's kind of like unfathomable. And it's allowed us to also reach out across the globe. So we're not being so hyper local anymore. We're actually kind of reaching out and seeing partnerships based on this pretty, calamity that we're kind of all in. Thank you for taking a moment with that. Tina, it's so good to see you.
Hi.
Yeah, and so Tina, and I want to ask you some of the questions I've asked some of the other panelists, so I'll be going back and forth a little bit just so everyone kind of knows what's happening here. I wanted to kind of, ask you, since you are in the Bay Area, why do you think investing, in culture in the Bay Area is important? Why do we think our support, could come from or should come from, outside of the Bay Area and outside of, the United States? What are your thoughts?
Well, true confession, I'm on the East Coast now, which is one of the outcomes of COVID. No, I mean, I think for Facebook, investment in the Bay Area is really essential. We have a huge footprint in the Bay Area. It's we are part of the community, and it is part of us. In terms of our program, part of our program is called the Analog Research Lab, and it's decidedly analog. It's really about being a foil to the digital space and the digital work that Facebook is engaged in. And it's intended to be a reminder of, process and the value of handmade. And we sort of think of artists as the original hackers. And we really want to celebrate that spirit inside of Facebook. So we really see this program as a way of creating space for that dialogue, that behind every technologist, every engineer, every programmer, every developer is a creative person. And so we want to bring those those communities together in a spirit of learning and experimentation and collaboration. So, the Bay Area obviously is just a very natural place for that. In addition, I would say, I think Barry mentioned it in his intro, the connection between the counterculture and technology, I think is very much alive in the Bay Area. And we think about artists as small businesses. And, as Facebook, it's really important for us to support small businesses. And so we really do try to approach it in that way and think about ways to create economic opportunity in a place like the Bay Area, which is really complex and and complicated for creative and cultural producers.
I really appreciate you, mentioning that artists as small businesses. I think that's something that we need to kind of magnify as we think about artists and all of the work that we're doing, whether it's around public partnerships, public-private partnerships, finding funding from foundations or members or whatever. I think that changing the narrative around how critical artists are to all of our local economies is key. And of course, I'm in the Bay Area, so I'm going to plug the Bay Area. And, this is, we are about the counterculture. So it's kind of like, give us a challenge, and how do we find a way of riffing on that? And how do we even, act as disruptors, and we're in this very disruptive moment right now. And I think all around the world, everyone is kind of hacking their realities, whatever those needs are, from supplying, helping other organizations do the work that they're doing. It's kind of a fascinating moment for sure. While I have you on the line, Tina, I am curious about how COVID has affected, your work at Facebook, in terms of plans or funding approaches.
Yeah.
What's different?
Honestly, it's hard to think of a way that it hasn't changed us, at least in the immediate term. For starters, as I said, our work has been historically analog based and physically based. So we've done, more than 700 site specific commissions for Facebook offices around the world. Well, we just can't get into those spaces now. So, all of that planning continues behind the scenes, but we can't be in those spaces. We can't install new artworks. So that has obviously had a profound effect on us during these last months, and it's forced us to pivot our entire program to the digital space. And one of the things that we do, in addition to commissioning artists to create works, is we work with hundreds of teaching artists to deliver workshops and creative engagements for Facebook employees, which is really a way of extending that space I described for this intersection. And so we've pivoted all of that learning online, basically overnight. What's interesting is, to your point about COVID creating opportunities that didn't necessarily exist before, or has accelerated opportunities. What we've found in being apart from one another, tens of thousands of employees who can no longer be together, is that there's no accidental creation of social fabric anymore. Everything has to be intentional. And so these workshops and these creative experiences that we can deliver are a really great way of building cohesion and resilience. So we have teams, there are something like 8,000 teams at Facebook, but we have, dozens, hundreds of teams coming to us to connect around these creative experiences. And that's been, something that I don't think we leaned into as much before COVID. We delivered all of these workshops, but it was kind of more an individual exercise, but we're finding that they're really helpful for teams. We've also, taken some of our funding and shifted it into the public space, because that's in a lot of cases where people can experience art now. So we've funded several public mural projects, in San Francisco and Austin, Seattle. We're working on something that's more national in scope right now. And so just really looking for those opportunities to continue creating opportunities for our artists and for our internal Facebook community to engage with artwork.
That's great. Thank you so much. John Pablo, I have not forgotten about you.
Hi, Marie.
You're there. I see you. I hope you're doing well this morning. Thanks for being with us. So just going back to an earlier question that I had asked, and you can tell us a little bit about your work as well if you want to take a step back. But the question is, what is your strategy for how you support culture, and why are you doing this? I think a lot of times we almost all want to ask ourselves almost every day when we wake up, why am I doing this again? I'm sure we have multiple answers, but it's always great to hear from other colleagues, like, really, how are you doing this and why are you doing this?
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so a little bit about myself to set a little bit of context. I've been a practitioner in the technology field now for close to 40 years. And in the past 15 years, I've been very, very involved with the intersection of art and technology. And I've worked on some large-scale projects that combine the two. I think a recent one where I played a small but significant role, I like to think, was the Bay Lights project. So I worked with Illuminate the Arts and Leo on the technical implementation of that. And that was a very, very interesting project to be close to in terms of understanding funding and execution models. Now I'm at NTT Disruption. NTT Disruption is an innovation arm of NTT, the Japanese telco, which has had a very interesting focus on art and technology for the past 30 years through the NTT ICC, and which we found dovetailed very nicely with the NTT Disruption mission of pursuing innovation. In terms of why we're doing it, one of the things that we realized is that innovation focused exclusively on technology is very, very limiting. And we need a broader perspective in order to fully understand the repercussions and the utility of what we do to humanity as a whole. A key part of the NTT Disruption proposition is that we're going to be doing things for good, technological innovation for good. And to do that successfully, we really have to understand much more than the implementation. I like to say that, you know, technology provides the function, design makes it usable, and art makes it meaningful. And one of the things that we found is that those are not necessarily entirely distinct technologies. As I think Barry has pointed out on several occasions, many of the artists working with technology are technology practitioners. They are coders who are also creating art. They are digital artists who are making video games, but also making art. So these things overlap. And there's definitely a linking between, you know, tech and design, tech and art, design and art, which is very, very productive. So why are we doing this? We don't just want to commission artworks. We don't want to, you know, decorate our space. We want to engage with the process of creative innovation by involving people with these backgrounds. One of the things that inspired me a great deal was that I was at Autodesk for a while, and the Pier 9 workshop was a really great example of how this works, where artists were in the workshop, they were using the tools, and it was exciting to see the process of how they learned about the tools, how they explored their limits, and then the kinds of things they produced. So, so I think that's probably a pretty good sense of why we're doing this. We feel that we can't really do what we intend to do without involving art and design as part of our community.
Thank you. There's a lot of really fascinating intersection, obviously, with the work that you're all doing. I don't come from the technological side of arts and culture. And so for me, this is really fascinating to hear. And I'm not quite sure who's like in our audience and who's listening in. I imagine that there are a number of artists, producers, you know, people who are running organizations. It'd be interesting for folks to also hear you all kind of converse with each other about what you're doing, you know, in this moment, and ask each other questions, because we don't really have these opportunities to be together. So I don't have questions for you to ask each other because I'm not in your fields per se, but I know selfishly, I would just like to imagine if I'm a producer or an artist or a technologist right now, you know, whether I'm in the Bay or, you know, in the EU or Canada, wherever I am, what is this moment about? And what are we hoping to achieve? What are we looking forward to, you know, from all the work that you're doing? What's next? Just jump in.
I'll jump in.
Yay.
I think one of the things that we've been trying to do is because the projects that we're involved in, I'm sorry, it's getting dark in here. It's getting dark outside and in front of the window. But a lot of the agenda now for the STARTS projects is really to address social issues and social concerns. And what we've been trying to encourage, and we've seen results fairly quickly, is that artists and technologists, or artists as technologists in some cases, as was pointed out, are actively involved in what's next. And I think one of the things that has come up in a lot of our conversations is that COVID didn't come out of the blue. It's connected to other things. In particular, it's connected to climate change. So a lot of them are very concerned about how they can address that in some capacity, or the connection between them, and really want to take this moment to buckle down, I guess you could say, and really figure out where do we go next, and how can art and technology be a big forerunner in that change in some way. So we've heard a lot of artists and artist collaboration, because the STARTS projects are all about collaboration and making way to collaborate, not only art, science, art, technology, but also with communities and in particular different kinds of organizations and companies. And kind of the idea is also to push industry to do better and to be better in lots of ways, and not just around the environment, but in their practices and efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I think we've heard a lot of them say, we're taking this moment and we're going to be part of the change.
I would love to pick up on that as well. I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of the same, and something that we've been thinking a lot about is, you know, art showed up for everyone on day one of COVID, you know, whether it was, you know, the signs in the window or chalk on the sidewalks. I mean, art just showed up, and it's part of our, you know, philosophy that artists are an essential part of a healthy community, and so they are also going to be essential for building our communities back, and we hope better than they were before. And so, you know, we have been thinking a lot about that, and the question of equity and all of the inequity that this moment has revealed. You know, Facebook exists to give people a voice, right? And so how do we, you know, make sure that we give that opportunity to as many people, as many artists as we can, because we think they have something important to say, and we can't build back without them.
Yeah, if I may come in at this point, what I find interesting in this moment is, at least in our discussions here in Europe, is that what came about through COVID is how fragile the sort of cultural and artistic landscape is, and especially because, yeah, the live events, public events have come to a standstill, and so a lot of artists have lost their income. Luckily, in most countries of the EU, there are funding systems that provide support throughout this crisis, because it's pretty much part of the of the normal fabric, or there's a lot of public funding that sustains structures. But at the same time, even though we have this fantastic public funding landscape, still, I mean, a lot of artists are suffering, and a lot of programs have been put on to at least alleviate some of the stress that artists, especially small sort of solo artists, you know, the smallest businesses and very small businesses have experienced. And what I wonder is, what does it look like for you, and how can, I mean, there's a couple of privately associated funders in this virtual room. So what have been concrete? You've mentioned some, but what about the overall system, sort of sustaining this artistic sector wherever you are? Goes out to all of you.
Yeah, that's a question that people in my circle definitely bring up over and over again. I think, as you point out, there is no real, there's not quite a safety net in the same sense that it exists in the EU for artists. And I think there is a key role for organizations to step in and fill that in. I mean, to some extent, NTT is a new arrival to the scene. We are in the process of building out a flagship space in San Francisco to act as a community hub. We've had an R&D presence here, but you know, I think our key thing is now to build out this physical space that will act as a canvas for projects that bring together art, design, and technology. And we hope that this is one good way of starting to support the community. I know that the Autodesk program was a huge factor in helping sustain an artistic community, and we hope that we can do something like that. But it is an issue. I mean, the existence of a safety net, I think, gives a degree of creative and expressive freedom that is difficult to achieve if you are seeking, commissions and works and getting into privately funded programs.
Yeah, one of the other things we've been thinking about, I mean, this was before COVID, but COVID has accelerated it, is just thinking about how we can bring artistic thinking into our product space. Mm-hmm. So, bringing artists together with product teams on mm-hmm. a topic of shared interest, whether it's privacy or identity or, it could be anything really. And I'm really interested in your work, Camille, with VR in that spirit. But, just really thinking about what opportunities can we create that go beyond the kind of the traditional model of like commissioning work and, we can't get into the offices, as I said, and there's limited opportunities to experience art depending on where you are. But it's not all about the end product. Our program is really about the process, and so let's create new opportunities to celebrate that part of the artistic process.
Yeah, I can speak to that from both hats, but I'm seeing online commissions or residencies, I guess. But STARTS has really been focused on that process that you're talking about. It's all about bringing people together and seeing what happens and giving them some time and some money, and often spaces as well. Like all of the STARTS projects are quite different from each other, but a lot of it's about, like, for example, there's a project now, that's going on right now called Reframe. It's called the Lighthouse Project because it focuses more on design than on art. But they have 3 hubs, and they have designers pitch projects. They put them together with experts like scientists and technologists, assign them to a hub based on their proposal, and they work for, I can't remember because I'm not in that project, I think it's 6 to 8 months. And they, of course, they're all have in mind that they're going to create something that's an innovation of some sort, but they are free to sort of play, and it's commissioning the process rather than commissioning the outcome. And I think I'm personally I've been very interested in that in my own practice, that some of it's the experimentation that brings up new, if you want to say, innovations, rather than the outcome. So yeah, and STARTS is really about supporting that process, and before COVID, but definitely now it continues to be so.
I find that really important, because I think if I were to think of a downside of these established funding structures, is that it's hard to get in if you're not already in, and especially if you want to do different things, because it's not that there is an overflow of money that's available for culture. In fact, it's actually really difficult to do advocacy for cultural funding. And we're just sort of watching, what happens in the European Parliament and what happens in some of the national parliaments. But currently, there's the new financial framework for the EU is under discussion. It's extremely hard to convince those that really sit on the buckets where money is being put in, to convince them that culture has an important role to play in our societies. And it's I don't think it gets the recognition that it deserves. And so there's very little money, and then everyone is sort of fighting for it. And I think what I would see would be a very good way where both these funding system, private versus public, I don't even know if they're so opposed, but I think what sort of private sources where they can be more open or flexible is probably, to allow these processes where you don't necessarily know the outcome and just try something new. And one of the things that sort of our approach when we sort of do activities on a global scale, often, of course, then, the money comes from the global north, it comes from Europe. And so in trying to set a counter or to sort of balance that imbalance that comes in through that, money supported power, is to change the value system and say, we do actually want to go into a process of mutual listening and learning and into a spirit of dialogue, and then come up together with activities and initiatives that make sense in a certain certain environment and context. And I think this is why we can have projects like the Grid, that look at a very sort of local issue, but then also take it to the global sphere. And there I completely agree that COVID has also pushed us in a way to explore that more, because I don't think that we would have, would I have flown in for a panel discussion that would have been based maybe in San Francisco? Maybe not, because the footprint would have been too big, but or Camilla also joining from the UK. But now in this new environment, this is possible. And I think that's also a very good alleyway to explore further.
I'd kind of like to bounce off of that and ask a question real quick to everybody, which is, Gray Area has been for 12 years now focused on supporting the community in San Francisco, the cultural community, working in these interdisciplinary practices. And since I think one of the great opportunities and benefits of something like the Grid and having unique support in that, it was hard enough to have an independent cultural organization here before COVID. And there are exceptions to this statement, but by and large, the technology industry and the sort of, as the cost has driven up and wealth has been created, that has not really gone to supporting independent culture locally in the city. When there are programs, they're usually siloed within things like campuses and other internal programs. And so my question to everybody is just what, one of the arguments we've been making for years, which I think is true, is that a robust, independent cultural milieu is a necessary foundational component for any sort of economically viable technology practice and industry in a city. And we've gotten to a situation where we have, gentrification of the mind here in the Bay Area, and that sort of technology has been exported around the world. I mean, we can see the effects of that. So my question to everybody is just very basically, for those out there that may be listening that could be in funding positions to help support things that are going on with all of the organizations that the Grid is showcasing, very basically, why is it important to fund arts and culture in a time like this? I mean, what is the argument for that? And John, seems like you have a first answer.
Yeah, I like to jump in because one of the things that is fascinating about our current situation is that it is global. There are a bunch of people that historically have felt that they could isolate from wars and pandemics and plagues and starvation. We could see it on TV, but generally we weren't affected. Here, everybody's being affected. We can't travel. We stay home. The schools are closed. And so there is a group here that I don't think we've discussed yet, which is, of course, the general public, society as a whole. And in a situation where everybody's involved in a crisis like this, the search for meaning making by literally everybody becomes a pressing need. So I'd say that this is an opportunity for the tech field in particular, as you point out, it's made a lot of money. It's to start thinking of like, wow, a vaccine probably isn't going to solve everything that has been highlighted as a result of this crisis. There needs to be some real thought on what does this mean? What did this highlight? What are the stories that we can create around how this crisis happened and how it can react to it? We can't just say, hey, we got sick and here's a vaccine and we're cured. We have to start weaving together a story of like, well, we disrupted natural habitats. This has created, the crossover of viruses into people. What can we do about that? It's been exacerbated by climate issues. The fires in California, we have to stay indoors because the air is bad and there's no place we can go because of COVID, and then we had a heat wave last week, so we couldn't even open the windows when the air was good, right? So, so art as a way of starting to weave together those narrative strands is important, that we not end up thinking that this was this tiny punctual thing and we solved it through a simple intervention. So I think there's an extremely powerful role there.
I find Barry's question really interesting. I mean, it's a huge question, why to support the arts and culture. But I want to come back to how you described the context that you're acting in, because it reminds me of a different place where I used to work, which was in Kinshasa. That's in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is in Central Africa. And there also, it was very hard for private and small independent cultural organizations to exist, because basically there was no public funding structure for the arts. And at the same time, there was a number of people or families or companies that amassed amounts of money, but there was also no sort of private funding, at least not structured. It was about decorating places or, throwing nice events. And so it's funny to draw a line from San Francisco to Kinshasa, but to come back to that. To your question, I mean, I feel like, it's easy to give sort of answers, but that they might sound too simplistic. I mean, I think as a society that thrives would want artists to think independently and question things and give them also the room to express that, because it enriches all of us. I also believe that there's art should be done because of art. I mean, it doesn't really need any reasoning behind it, but I also understand in the ways that we deal here with close to the European Commission and the institutions and politics, that is something with which you don't really win any argument. And so what's been said here is often, the arts also contribute to economic development, they contribute to social cohesion. And I think from a very personal perspective, what I've seen also is that when everything was shut down during the lockdown, I turned to books, I turned to films, I turned to artistic production, right? Because it's a fundamental part of my life. And if I were to organize a cultural landscape, I would make sure that you have something from all kinds, opera and the film industry, but also sort of more disruptive or more avant-garde or more progressive kind of outlets. But I feel like some answering that question in a 2-minute statement is also a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I would like to say I agree with what was just said, but also, and this is maybe a political stance, is that I know from the projects that I've been involved in, and what's happened in the STARTS has been funded from DigiConnect in the European Commission, which is really about technology and communications. And it was kind of a mission of one individual person in the commission who really wanted to show the tech industry and those that were out there, both companies and researchers and artists alike, that there's something that we can give to each other and share. And in particular, that artists with catalytic thinking could really push industry toward different, as you say, disruptive, I guess, solutions that they hadn't thought of and are uncomfortable with. And a lot of the solution that the projects that I've been associated with or indirectly are about making industry slightly uncomfortable and pushing them out of their safe zone and getting them to think differently. And COVID has just pushed this further. And we actively get projects that are about a small company working with an artist in-house, or vice versa, people from industry working in an artist studio, or trying to find ways to make them uncomfortable as a way to do different. So I think the answer is to, from the position that I'm in at the moment, is that, and it's not a quick answer either, but is that industry needs to connect with artists and bring them in. And this has been happening for, 60 years probably, and probably in America just as much as Europe. But the idea being that our position is we've been trying to sell industry that they need artists, I guess, and that if they're not willing to pay for it, the commission is willing to help them to get there, or part of the way, to do prototypes or to do the first leg of the journey. And I don't know that that's something that's possible in the US unless it's coming from corporations to begin with. I don't know what's happening in the government, so I can't say anything about that. But it's really definitely pushing industry from the artistic position. I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like that's a big part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what we are trying to do as well. I mean, before I came to Facebook, I was on a different side of this equation because I was at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And, so many times we would be like, oh, why can't we get, one of these tech giants to come and fund this major initiative that we want to do? And it was very hard to make those relationships. They take time. You're often, dealing with a community that doesn't necessarily encounter art in a way that they understand as meaningful every day. And so, it was really like, okay, if this is what we want, we're going to have to invest in this over like decades, because just because money exists doesn't mean it flows, where it's needed. And so, one of the things that we do through our program is really try to reconnect people with art, in their work, in their life, help them re-engage with the social utility of art, help people understand how to look at art. Lots of people, especially in the US, the arts are just devalued. And so many people grow up with very little relationship, very limited relationship, and yet it's ever present and we're all experiencing it. But I think the art world too has not done itself the best. It's done itself a disservice in some ways by making it seem removed or hard to understand. And that's not true of every aspect of the art world, but, having come from the institutional side, I think I can say that. And so I think there's a responsibility on both sides. It's to, we always say, let the artists lead. And we really try to give artists as much freedom as we possibly can. But I think there's also a responsibility to connect that with things that are happening in people's lives. We've talked a lot about COVID. We haven't really talked about the, racial inequity that's happening, around the world, but so acutely in the United States. The stresses that people are feeling, it's a responsibility for us to connect the art to the things that people are thinking about and worrying about and experiencing in their lives, so that relationship just becomes closer.
I think a good example that might shed some light on this is the Bay Lights and the way that was funded and carried out, because the Bay Lights was entirely privately funded. No taxpayer, no government money involved. A significant percentage of the funds raised came from a relatively small number of wealthy donors who were, however, very willing to tolerate absolute creative freedom, and a significant portion of the funding actually came from the general public. And I think one of the reasons why the project was successful, to Tina's point, is that the Bay Lights was sold to the public. It was presented to the public as something that would excite the entire community, and it created a very visible public icon that people have grown used to and enjoy. I mean, the first phase of the Bay Lights lasted 2 years, and it came down and it went up again as a permanent thing. And there was a massive wave of support for bringing it back. So this is an interesting, so there's the corporate funding, there's public funding, but there's this potential hybrid model that is illustrated by the Bay Lights, where, a very efficient and motivated and driven foundation, Illuminate the Arts, was very effective at, bringing this project to life and selling it, not just to wealthy donors, but to an entire community. So I think there's potential there. Another inspiration to me is a Team Lab, the Japanese group, which has been enormously successful. They became the largest single artist cultural exhibition in the world, I think, last year before things shut down. Part of it is because it's a spectacle, it's entertaining, but their work does have significant artistic and creative depth behind it. Their fine arts projects are pretty inspiring. And that's another promising example of where, large scale art can succeed by working directly with the public. And that's a model that I think is interesting to explore and pursue.
I was just going to jump in here. I know we have only a few minutes left, but I scribbled a bunch of notes. But one thing about the Bay Lights, as you mentioned, that is, to me, it was kind of like a successful example of a public-private partnership as well. Because when we talk about selling a project and how do we get like these local tech firms involved, one thing I learned, and I'll just be super brief about it, is that, one year when I did venture out and go to Burning Man, I was trying to figure out why everybody was so interested in Burning Man. And then you go out to the Deep Playa and you see all these beautiful art installations. And because people want to participate in art that's being created. So I think with with the Bay Lights, people felt like they literally were purchasing the individual lights that were going onto a bridge. So it gave people a point of involvement with a project. And I think that that's why it's been a very big gulf in trying to get tech firms to support art, right? And so we're in San Francisco, we're a stone's throw from Salesforce, Twitter, Facebook, and all these other places. And, so how do we, at this moment, because it's a different moment, how do we now go back and make these approaches to these very same people? And so I think that there is possibility. And I think that because everyone is so isolated and sheltering in place, we actually have access to people in ways that we didn't before. And I will say that for foundations, this is also a very disruptive moment for them, because they're now looking at changing how they're funding programming. They're also kind of peeling back the layers. So I think that there's opportunity in this moment. It just requires, continued thought and approaches. But I see the future as a public-private partnership. I think that's the way forward. We had a couple of questions from some audience members, and one of them is, what can the U.S. and the EU ecosystems learn from each other? And we'll kind of close it out on that question. So just jump in. So what can the U.S. and the EU ecosystems learn from each other?
Well, I think what we in Europe or in the EU can learn from U.S. funding systems, I would say, is that more organizations or other bodies or entities take responsibility also for funding, because it's I think here companies, some of them do have foundations and some do support the arts, but not in a structured way. And I think probably this is also a bit the downside of public funding. It's the idea would be to create something long term, so that it's so that there's a bit of a reliability also for the livelihood of people who depend on that funding. But I think that's definitely something that we can take from the US.
I don't have really much to add to that. I think that's true, but I think the other interesting thing is there seems to be a lot more, or I could be wrong, but a lot more corporate investment in arts than there is maybe in the European landscape, really. There's a little bit here and there, like was mentioned, but not as much as in the US.
I had the opportunity to work on a project in Helsinki for several years when I was at the Guggenheim, and the government, made, both the city and national government made so much of the research and development part of the project possible. And I really admired that. And I think that if some of that could be adopted in the US, not for the government to pay for everything, but to provide the seed money for an idea to be explored and to really understand artists as problem solvers, I think, that would be a really beneficial learning for us.
I'm struck by how the EU intentionally recognizes the importance of arts and culture and foregrounds it. To me, that is huge. And one way of demonstrating it is through funding. And it's not just the money, it's the fact that it's foregrounded as a priority that I think is a powerful learning for the US.
Great. I think we're right at time here. So I'd just like to thank everybody for showing this great conversation. I wish we had another hour because there's a lot to get to the bottom of. Thanks again to EUNIC and the Grid. Thank you, Maria, for moderating, and good night and good luck.